Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to be discussing the affirmative action ruling by the Supreme Court. My initial thoughts. In Down to Earth, Bruno Latour presents a thought provoking analysis. There has been an abandonment of the 1%. Many elites are creating missions to Mars, they're creating underground tunnels, apocalyptic cliff societies. If you look at Bezos' Cliff House, for example. They have abandoned us, and for Bruno Latour, the sign was the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord. Now, that's not the only sign. The first sign was, of course, there's plenty of signs. We can go back to Reagan selling out American democracy to Iranian terrorists, or we can just talk about the 2008 financial crisis, where we were all robbed by the global petrodollar. And I'll get to that in a second. Latour argues that the decisions signals an abandonment of the shared responsibility to deal with climate change, global problems, etc., etc. The elite have detached themselves from any responsibility of mitigating these global problems and have resolved themselves to, in fact, widening the socioeconomic and environmental disparities. They will get the lifeboats first. Now, how does this relate to affirmative action? A couple years ago, there was a conference called Defending the West Conference. And there's been a bunch of these people trying to defend the West, whether it's Sam Harris or Jordan Peterson and all these guys defending the West. Why does the West need to be defended? It's because the West is already dead. It's already died many, many years ago. How did it die? Well, we're going to talk about that in a moment. The decision by the Supreme Court recently, well, I want to focus firstly by saying that for some reason, it doesn't affect the military-industrial complex. Affirmative action still applies to the military for some reason, which is interesting because they need, I guess, certain type of people in the military. That's a very curious issue for me, that the military was left out. And I think that's a very key issue. As you know, on my channel, I've been always arguing that intersectionality is integral to the logic of neoliberal colonialism. And there's been an obfuscation between what neoliberalism is and what conservatism is, or neoconservatism is. And we'll see this in my next video talking about the work of Melinda Cooper. Regardless, this wasn't a move by the 1%. The 1% have already gotten out. They killed Epstein. They did all the things that they needed to do to not get their hands dirty anymore. The 1% are free. This is a response from the next ring of society, the conservatives. The next ring of society has also realized that the 1% has basically, and that's basically Trump, the Trumpians. Although Trump himself might be the ultimate postmodern morality, the conservatives here have also to tighten their belts. And I'm going to be arguing that this is just another example of declining American power. In my other video, we talked about how we need to get rid of the idea that America is number one, that American exceptionalism. So what are we talking about when we're talking about American exceptionalism? The decline of American exceptionalism. You can go back to the Bretton Woods system and the petrodollar, which are two fundamental components of the global economic architecture. And I've been watching a lot of Peter Zeihan, and it's really interesting to see where he gets things wrong more than when he gets things right. And I think that one thing he's wrong about is China. Regardless, the Bretton Woods system and the petrodollar system have been shaping the global finance for the last century or more. The Bretton Woods system, if you look at it historically, the Bretton Woods system emerged from the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. It led to the establishment of the IMF and the World Bank. It pegged other currencies to the US dollar, which in turn was pegged to gold at the value of $35 an ounce. The dollar became the world's reserve currency. Not only this, but the dollar also came with a moral supremacy, which itself we see. What is the moral supremacy of the dollar? The American Constitution unlike other constitutions, not like the Russian constitution, not like the Xi Jinping constitution, has never been changed from outside the constitution itself, which is powerful. That's called the rule of law. What do I mean by this? I mean that the American constitution can only be changed from within the constitutional structure itself, not from a dictator or anyone else telling it what to do. The highest law of the land is and always is the American Constitution. And the American Constitution is backed by what? It's backed by the American military and by the dollar, which is pegged to gold, and all the other currencies which have to do their exchange in the dollar. This is why Iraq was invaded later on. In the 60s, due to mounting external debts and an unfavorable balance of payments, the US was unable to maintain the gold standard. This led to the collapse of the Bretton Woods in 71, when Nixon declared that the US would no longer exchange gold for US dollars held in foreign reserves, marking the end of the Bretton Woods system. Now, it was only the American military and the American morality, the moral high ground. It's ironic that Nixon was, upholding at the time. So, with the end of the Bretton Woods, the US needed a new way to ensure that the dollar remained the world's dominant reserve currency. And so the answer was the creation of the petrodollar in the 70s. And this is what Iran exploited in the 1970s with the Iranian Shah. And that's why he was taken out of the picture, which is why the Middle East is the way it is today, even though the Shah was an American puppet. Under the petrodollar system, oil exporting countries, especially Saudi Arabia and OPEC, agreed to price and sell their oil only in US dollars in exchange for weapons and military protection. For those of you who are watching what's going on in global geopolitics today, you know where I'm going with this. The agreement required countries around the world to hold large amounts of US dollars in their foreign exchange reserves, ensuring that the dollar status of the world's dominant currency would remain stable. So after the collapse of Bretton Woods and the pegging of the dollar, the petrodollar system helped maintain the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency, backed by oil this time and not gold. It was kind of shocking for a lot of nations where, the Americans, the Nixon just came out and said, "Oh well, good luck. you can't exchange gold anymore. Gold for our," and that was a big deal. You can't exchange American dollars for gold anymore. Even on the American dollar, it said that you can exchange that. This is legal tender, right? So the Bretton Woods system led to significant imbalances, contributing to its own collapse. And the petrodollar has also contributed to geopolitical tensions, environmental degradation due to a reliance on oil, and economic instabilities, especially with the case of 1979 revolution and Iran. Since oil prices and hence the revenue of oil exporting countries are dominated in the US dollar, it subjects these countries to currency risk, and their economies can be heavily affected by the fluctuations of the dollar in value. So, fast forward until 2008. We have extreme inflation. We have Saudi Arabia on the verge of changing its petrodollar system and making security alliances with China. So in the book, How to Hide an Empire, A History of the Greater United States, Daniel Imwar gives us an exploration of the history of the United States and reveals its true nature as an empire, in contrast to what we learn in school. America is not an empire, unlike its colonial past and that's its colonial yoke of overthrowing the British, etc. The thesis can be understood in two parts. He posits that throughout history, the US has exercised power and influence over territories outside the mainland, Puerto Rico, Philippines, Guam, Samoa, and others. These territories have been hidden from American history. And secondly, if you look at the American empire on a map, we can call, in terms of the painting movement, pointillism. It's a pointillism empire, with thousands, I say, of little tiny territories that are acquired throughout the world. It's very similar to what China is doing in terms of the Great Belt and Road Initiative. China has learned from the West. China has learned colonialism from the West, and it's about to have a big struggle with the West, or it's having a big struggle right now regarding this kinds of pointillism. What do I mean? So there's lots of little islands, there's lots of little territories. China's doing the same with these free economic zones. After the World War II era, the US has moved away from territorial colonization to a form of influence marked by soft power, military bases, economic dependencies, cultural influence gathered around the world. And one of those key pieces of soft power is the English language, of course. So, military bases. So, throughout the world, the US has military bases. We know this. There's economic dependencies with regards to what I just talked about, the petrodollar, IMF, international trade, foreign aid, both military and non-military, can be used to leverage and sway policies in other countries. The status of primary reserve currency gives the US monetary policy outside of its sovereign borders in a way. Hollywood films and American music are spreading American values and ideas, and today we can see the limits of that. And finally, we can see that there are political influences which shape international policy in ways that align with its own interests, using those foreign aid benefits, basically bribes. So these are the dots of influence, as Daniel calls them. Spread throughout the world, he creates a pointillism picture of American influence and power. So unlike traditional empires, which exerted direct or indirect rule, this form of influence is really a laissez-faire approach to colonialism. And I use that word specifically because it is a form of neoliberal colonialism or neocolonialism. We move on to what are some aspects of diminishing American empire. So firstly, the obvious economic influence is diminishing. So with the rise of countries like China and India, and the decline of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency, or the US slowly losing its status as the world's largest economy, or just the political or economic inequality in America itself. Can we see the rise of dictatorships throughout the world as a kind of a decline in cultural influence, the lack of belief in democracy? This is a point that we should really be worried about. America has ever really been a true democracy, or even close to it. At least it was selling it. At least it was making the argument. At least it had that idealism. So there has been a decline in that, people buying basically that American dream, people buying the idea that democracy can work. And even, people like Justin Trudeau has said stuff like, oh, I admire the dictatorships that can just make decisions and blah, blah, blah. There's a loss of technological leadership with around the world. Countries are becoming more independent with regards to technological innovation. There's less influence in higher education. And again, this is what we're coming back to. The higher education in American universities really held in high regard now. With the rise of forms of learning, AI specifically, we can see that higher education isn't a big deal anymore, or it might not be such a big deal anymore. It will become more and more spread out. And just also the decrease in military dominance itself. The Chinese empire, the CCP right now, is building enough warfare ships to exceed that of the United States sooner or later, technologically and numerically. And finally, and this is why, this last point is why Putin thinks or thought, if you guys don't remember the beginning of the war, Putin was really motivated by in my eyes, by the lack of national unity and the excessive internal struggles within the United States. The internal stability, or the lack of internal stability in recent years, where we have growing political polarization in general, social unrest, persistent issues regarding healthcare, education, infrastructure, lack of infrastructure. So it's crucial that a nation's international influence is not only determined by its external actions, but also how it's perceived internally. And domestic instability can detract from a country's ability to maintain a unified policy stance, potentially making it less effective on the global stage. People used to look up to America because they had the moral high ground. But check out my video on the moral bankruptcy of America. So deep political divisions, social unrest, all forms of tension, polarization, an inability to listen to each other, a declining belief in democracy, an increasing belief in authoritarianism. All of these are affecting its moral authority. America is not only inflated monetarily, it's inflated morally. So there's been a decrease in attraction to the American lifestyle. There's been a loss of moral high ground. And especially because when it's just totally hypocritical when you're supposed to be a beacon for democracy and human rights and rule of law, but you have the 1% of your country always doing whatever they want. And now we come back to the challenges to American education and academia. So and this goes with what I'm arguing in my other anti-psychology series regarding the crisis of science and the crisis of replicability that is happening in science. And the fact that neoliberal publish or die culture has so much contributed to the crisis of science. Other countries are slowly, hopefully, maybe, if I'm not saying hopefully with regards to the end of American empire, I'm saying hopefully with regards to just general human well-being, everyone is improving their scientific research, and they're looking at the science, the publish or die science that's coming out of America as a problem, as them having to create their own, be just like how you have to be economically resilient, you have to be technologically and scientifically resilient as well, and independent, especially in a World War III situation that we are, post-apocalypse that we're living in now. Other signs are, the most ominous signs are the information warfare that we live in today. In the age of digital media, everyone is trying to control the narrative, and there's so much hypocrisy. The information has become a crucial element of soft power, and this is a key aspect of the Putin regime. The changes in immigration patterns around the world also have seen slight variations. We can see that less and less people are coming to the United States. There's less adoption of US foreign policy practices or policy practices around the world. You can't persuade people to adopt American policies, practices, and systems, especially the democratic norms, when you see that the democratic norms in America, look at what they've created. We can go back to what's happened in Africa, as if you see all these African conferences right now, what happened during the pandemic when there was such a loss of trust? You didn't have to go to colonial times to explain the loss of trust and moral bankruptcy of the United States. When during the pandemic, there was so much hypocrisy about helping all these people, and we're going to spend billions of dollars on spreading the pandemic goods to everybody. But then what happened instead? It was just a bunch of hoarding. And that was what all these African channels are talking about. As a response, we can see what's happening with Mali, with the loss of reputation of France in the African sphere. France, which needs to maintain its own neo-colonial empire as well. And we can see that the Wagner Group is in Africa, trying to spread its own influence there as well. The failure of the world to come together to respond to the global crisis of the pandemic was the canary in the coal mine of the global ability to come together and to deal with the crisis of global warming. Recently, there's been a research about how climate change is, and all of these American petroleum and American fossil fuels, or just fossil fuels around the world, are contributing to what's happening, the smoke we see in the skies every day. We live in a post-apocalyptic world. The fact that we weren't able to all come together to deal with the pandemic, that's a warning or a lesson. It's either a warning or a lesson. So what can we make of this US Supreme Court striking down affirmative action in college admissions? Again, they didn't strike down affirmative action when it comes to the military. That's one thing. Regardless, this can be seen as another aspect of declining American soft power, where the 1% have already seen the situation as is and have basically abandoned all of us and have already gone for the lifeboats, now we see the American conservatives, who are the next, let's say the next 10%, the next rich people, they have noticed that the 1% has but the next 10%, they don't have the ability to, as well, let's say, avoid taxation like the 1% does. So they are tied to the system. So what do they do instead? This is just, again, another last gasp of the old patriarchal order. Last gasp of the dying empire. Why do I say this? In prison, prisoners, or in the panopticon of control of modern neoliberalism, has always been a dualistic kind of thing between the old order of juridical power and the new order of neoliberal biopolitics. Juridical order is that we still put people in dungeons, and the biopolitics is we call it a corrective institution. Corrective. So what is healthcare for in terms of the neoliberal perspective? Healthcare isn't necessarily a socialist thing in a neoliberal colonialist perspective. Healthcare is rather basically giving antibiotics to your tax farm. That's the kind of healthcare that we get. We don't get, for example, nutrition, holistic healthcare, all this stuff. We get a lot of talk about it, but in reality, we live in a world that is filled with forever chemicals and glyphosate and etc., microplastics, and all of these things that we have no control over. At the same time, for example, the Canadian government recently comes down on restricting nutrition pills because they want to find a way to make new money. So I'm coming from a Canadian perspective. So again, internal contradiction, or the internal battle between the old order, old kind of rule, which is by the fist, by the patriarchy, and the new type of rule, which is neoliberal, pretending to care, having emotional intelligence tests while you're in a corporate environment that is extracting surplus labor from the masses. You have a sensitivity training seminar. That's the neoliberal part. And so it's never really socialism versus conservatism. It's actually neoliberalism versus neoconservatism. And now we can see that there is a shrinking of American power. And that's what this affirmative action is really a sign of. This affirmative action ruling is really a sign of. The ruling is a sign of what's happening in the conservative world, the pushback on the neoliberal policies. Now, what do neoliberal policies do? Neoliberal policies are incredibly generous. Neoliberal policies give foreign aid. Just like how we give foreign aid, we have welfare programs which keep people under the rule, the state. That's what it's for. Now, the inability of the American empire to exert soft power around the world, and now exert soft power even in its own backyard, with Florida and all of these conservative states coming out against free healthcare, because this is the last roar of the old order, fighting back, trying to get whatever it can before who knows what really hits the fan. Just as Latour signals how the abandonment is a shared reality that we can see, the shared reality of all being on the planet, the abandonment of the 1% from the Paris Accord, these types of events, examples of the abandonment of the next strata of society, the first estate, the second estate, the third estate. This is the second estate, let's say. The second estate is abandoning its responsibilities, the rest of the estates. It doesn't even have to play the white man's burden card anymore. Now, what's also interesting is the amount of essentialism coming from the left. The essentialist arguments that are being made to defend the supposedly vulnerable and victims of the situation. So we have the best example I can think of is a tweet from Erica Marsh. She says, "Today's Supreme Court decision is a direct attack on black people." Now, this is Erica reports. "No black person will be able to succeed in a merit-based system, which is exactly why affirmative action-based programs were needed Today's decision is a travesty. Now, there's no walking back from this tweet. she tries to clarify what she meant, but I mean, there's really no walking back from that tweet. No black person will be able to succeed in a merit-based system. That is the white man's burden. And the fact that the white man can no longer burden the burden, that is in itself a sign of rising multipolarity in the world. What does this all mean for you? It means that be prepared, because we don't know what's going to happen. The American democratic system, with all its faults, the closest thing that we've ever had, with all its faults, with all its colonization, with it being born out of blood, with it being structured by slavery, even with all that, what was developed through the Protestant Reformation, through the main story of the West, that was something special. Even if it was a lie, you see, even if it was a lie, the ideology upholds by itself, because it works even if you don't believe in it. That's how ideologies work. Now, there was something special there. There was something to fight for there. Now, what are we fighting for? We are returning back to nationalisms, because the left has been unable to really motivate or mobilize people on the basis of patriotism. We are seeing more and more. This is just another ramification of the right mobilizing against under the banner of nationalism. So thank you. Please keep tuned to the more work that I'm going to be doing on this channel. Everything I do is blocked and throttled. Thank you for listening, and thank you for making it all the way through.